The first thing Marcus Barrett did after signing the divorce papers was check his phone. Not because something urgent demanded his attention, but because looking at Nora Mitchell, soon to be his ex-wife, felt like acknowledging a decision he wanted behind him. The conference room smelled of leather and cold coffee, the kind of sterile professionalism that made endings feel cleaner than they were. Thaddeus Sterling sat at the head of the table, silver-haired and unreadable, his fountain pen resting beside a stack of documents that represented 7 years reduced to ink and legal jargon. Nora's hand moved across the final page with surprising steadiness. No pause, no tremor, just her signature appearing where the yellow tab indicated. Marcus watched from the corner of his eye, waiting for the crack he'd grown accustomed to seeing in her, the slight downturn of her mouth when he stayed late at the office, the way her shoulders would curl inward when he forgot to acknowledge something she'd said. But today she sat perfectly upright in a navy cardigan that had seen better seasons. Her dark hair pulled into a low bun that made her look older than 32, and her expression carried the kind of calm that unnerved him more than tears would have. He'd expected resistance. Most people fought for something, even if it was just pride. The prenuptial agreement they'd signed 6 years ago had been straightforward. What was his remained his, what was hers remained hers. And since Nora had brought nothing into the marriage except a toddler from a previous relationship and freelance income that barely covered groceries, the math was simple. She was leaving with exactly what she'd arrived with, nothing that mattered. Marcus leaned back in his chair, the leather creaking under his weight. "You're not even going to read the settlement terms?" Nora looked up, and for a moment their eyes met across the polished mahogany. Hers were dark, almost black in the winter light filtering through the floor-to-ceiling windows. "I trust the process." The words landed with a peculiar weight, though Marcus couldn't identify why. He forced a laugh, the kind he used in meetings when someone asked a question he found beneath him. "That's very mature of you. Most women in your position would have their own attorney present." Thaddeus Sterling's pen stopped moving. The lawyer had been a friend of Nora's late mother, a detail Marcus had found convenient when selecting representation for the divorce. No conflict of interest, no expensive litigation, no drawn-out drama that would interfere with the Helix Dynamics IPO scheduled for late spring. Sterling had handled everything with quiet efficiency, barely speaking during their 2 previous meetings, and Marcus had taken that silence as confirmation that this divorce was exactly what it appeared to be, a formality. "Ms. Mitchell is represented adequately," Sterling said, his voice carrying the trace of a Boston accent that money and decades hadn't quite erased. "And Mr. Barrett, you'll find everything in order. No assets to divide, no spousal support requested, and the child custody arrangement is already established through prior court order." Marcus nodded, satisfied. Owen, Nora's son, from whatever relationship had produced him before Marcus entered the picture, would remain with his mother, and Marcus would have no financial obligation to a child who wasn't his. Clean, simple. The way these things should be handled. He scrawled his signature across the designated lines, each stroke a small act of liberation. The penthouse apartment on the Upper East Side would remain in his name. The Tesla in the parking garage his. The investment portfolio he'd been building since his first real bonus at Helix untouchable. Nora would take her outdated laptop, her modest wardrobe, and whatever sentimental items she'd accumulated in a life that had clearly peaked when she'd somehow convinced him to marry her. Sterling gathered the documents, sliding them into a leather portfolio embossed with initials Marcus didn't recognize. "The decree will be filed with the court today. Barring any objections, which I don't anticipate, you'll both receive final copies within 6 weeks." Nora stood smoothing her cardigan over jeans that were frayed at the hems. She extended her hand to Sterling first, a gesture that struck Marcus as oddly formal for someone he'd assumed was just another struggling single mother grateful for 7 years of financial stability. "Thank you, Thaddeus, for everything." The lawyer's expression softened almost imperceptibly, a crack in the professional facade that made Marcus wonder if there was some history he'd missed. But then Sterling was shaking his hand as well, the grip firm and brief, and the moment passed. Marcus waited until they were in the elevator, the doors sliding closed on Sterling's office and the uncomfortable formality of legal proceedings before he spoke again. The descent from the 42nd floor felt longer than it should have, the LED numbers ticking down with maddening slowness. "So, what's your plan now?" Nora kept her eyes on the brushed steel doors. "I'll figure it out. You know you can't afford that apartment we were renting, not on freelance income." "I'm aware." The elevator chimed at the 38th floor. A woman in a power suit stepped in, her phone pressed to her ear, and Marcus fell silent. He studied Nora's reflection in the polished doors, the dark circles under her eyes that makeup didn't quite hide, the way she held herself small, as if occupying less space might make her less visible. 7 years ago, that fragility had appealed to him. She'd been easy to impress, easy to comfort, easy to shape into the kind of partner who didn't demand more than he was willing to give. But somewhere along the way, easy had become tedious, and tedious had become suffocating. Celeste Vaughn had appeared in his life like oxygen after drowning. 28, ambitious, sharp enough to challenge him in meetings, but smart enough to defer to him in public. She understood the game in a way Nora never had: how to dress for the industry, how to network without appearing desperate, how to be seen with the right people at the right events. When Celeste laughed at his jokes, it felt like validation. When Nora smiled, it felt like pity. The elevator opened onto the marble lobby, and Marcus checked his phone again. A text from Celeste glowed on the screen. "Done." He typed back quickly. "Clean break. Dinner at 8. 3 dots appeared then. "I'll make reservations." Nora was already walking toward the revolving doors, her canvas bag slung over one shoulder. Marcus caught up with her on the sidewalk, where February wind cut between the skyscrapers and sent pedestrians hunching into their coats. "Look, Nora, I know this is probably hard for you." She turned, and something in her expression made him pause. Not anger, not grief, just a kind of focused attention that felt unfamiliar. "I mean, 7 years is a long time," he continued, uncomfortable under her gaze. "And I'm not trying to be cruel, but you have to admit, we wanted different things. I'm building something at Helix. The IPO alone is going to change everything. And you're comfortable where you are. There's nothing wrong with that. It's just not what I need anymore." A taxi honked somewhere to their left. A street vendor called out about hot pretzels. Nora's dark hair whipped across her face in the wind, and she tucked it behind her ear with fingers that bore no jewelry. She'd already removed her wedding band. "I hope the IPO goes well, Marcus." The words should have sounded bitter, but they didn't. They sounded sincere, which somehow made them worse. "Thanks." He shifted his weight, suddenly eager to end this conversation and return to the world where he was, Marcus Barrett, Chief Innovation Officer, the man who'd turned a failing product line into Helix Dynamics' flagship offering. "Take care of yourself, and Owen." She nodded once, then turned toward the subway entrance at the corner. Marcus watched her disappear down the steps, her small frame swallowed by the afternoon crowd, and felt nothing except relief. His phone buzzed again. "Celeste. Can't wait to celebrate." Marcus smiled and started walking toward the parking garage where the Tesla waited. The divorce was over. The IPO was 6 weeks away. Celeste had already started moving her things into the penthouse, filling the spaces Nora had left with designer bags and expensive wine, and the kind of art that signaled you understood culture. Everything was falling into place exactly as it should. He didn't notice the black sedan that pulled away from the curb, 3 cars behind him, its windows tinted dark enough to hide whoever sat in the back seat watching him go. The apartment Nora and Owen moved into that evening sat above a bodega in a neighborhood Marcus had never visited and wouldn't recognize if he passed through. The stairs creaked with each step, and the walls were thin enough that cooking smells from adjacent units seeped through cumin and garlic and something sweet that might have been plantains. The landlord had asked for first month last month and a security deposit that Nora paid in cash from an envelope she'd been keeping in the lining of her largest suitcase. Owen stood in the center of the main room, which served as living area, dining space, and kitchen combined. His backpack sat at his feet, stuffed with the action figures and books he'd insisted on bringing himself, rather than letting the movers touch. At 9 years old, he'd learned early to protect what mattered to him. "Is this our house now?" Nora knelt to his level, brushing dark hair away from eyes that were hers in miniature, wide and observant and older than they should be. "For now, sweetheart, until we find something better. It's smaller than the other place." "It is, but it's ours." She stood surveying the space with the practiced eye of someone used to making do. 2 windows faced the street, their glass rippled with age but clean enough. A radiator clanked against the far wall, working hard to chase away February's chill. The furniture that came with the unit was sparse but functional. A futon that would serve as her bed, a small table with mismatched chairs, shelves that sagged in the middle, but would hold books well enough. Owen's room was barely large enough for a twin mattress and a dresser, but it had a door that closed and a window that looked out onto a fire escape where pigeons had built nests in the ironwork. He'd already claimed the space, arranging his action figures on the windowsill in some order that made sense to him. Nora unpacked boxes while Owen worked on his homework at the kitchen table, the scratch of his pencil and the occasional frustrated sigh, the only sounds besides traffic from the street below. She'd lived in places like this before, had grown up in them actually, before everything changed. The muscle memory of small spaces and careful budgets came back easily. Shop the discount groceries on Wednesdays, air dry clothes to save on laundromat quarters, keep one good outfit for anything that required looking put together. Her phone buzzed on the counter. A text from an unknown number. "Confirmation trust activation complete. Account access granted. T.S." Nora deleted it immediately, her expression unchanged. Owen looked up from his math worksheet, frowning at a long division problem. "Mom, can you help with this one?" She crossed to the table, leaning over his shoulder to study the numbers. Her hand rested lightly on his back, feeling the sharp ridge of his shoulder blade through his hoodie. He was growing so fast, shooting up in height, even as he remained rail-thin, all angles and energy barely contained. "Try breaking it down into smaller parts," she said softly. "See, if you take the first 2 digits..." He worked through it methodically, his tongue poking out slightly in concentration the way it had since he was a toddler. When he got the answer right, his face lit up with the kind of pure satisfaction that came from solving something difficult. "I did it." "You did. I'm proud of you." He turned in his chair, suddenly serious in the way children became when asking questions they'd been holding on to. "Mom, why did Marcus want us to leave?" Nora sat in the chair beside him, choosing her words with care. "Sometimes people grow in different directions. It doesn't mean anyone did anything wrong. It just means the path forward isn't the same for everyone. But he was mean to you. I heard him. Lots of times." The ache that bloomed in her chest had nothing to do with Marcus and everything to do with the fact that Owen had noticed had carried that weight without her knowing how heavy it had become. People aren't always kind when they're unhappy. But here's what matters. We're okay. You and me. We're going to be more than okay. Owen studied her face with an intensity that made him seem far older than 9. Then he nodded, apparently satisfied, and returned to his homework. Nora stood moving to the window where the street below pulsed with evening activity. Headlights swept past, illuminating pedestrians bundled against the cold. Somewhere a siren wailed. A couple argued in rapid Spanish on the corner, their voices carrying in the clear winter air. She thought about the papers she'd signed that morning, the way Marcus had looked at her with something between pity and dismissal, as if she were a problem he'd finally solved. She thought about Thaddeus Sterling's measured silence, the slight nod he'd given her when Marcus wasn't looking, confirmation that everything was proceeding exactly according to plan. Most of all, she thought about the letter her mother had written 8 years ago, the one Nora had found sealed in a safety deposit box 3 days after Vivian Ashford's funeral. The paper had been cream-colored, expensive, covered in her mother's elegant script. "My darling Nora, if you're reading this, I'm gone. And I'm sorry I couldn't stay longer. But I need you to understand something important. The money isn't yours yet. Not because I don't trust you, but because I trust you too much to let you skip the hardest lesson. Your father spent 20 years making me feel small. I stayed because I thought love required that sacrifice. I was wrong. Love should make you larger, braver, more yourself, never less. I've structured the trust with conditions. You won't inherit until you prove you can walk away from someone who diminishes you, and you must do it without using wealth as leverage. No lawyers on retainer, no private investigators, no money to smooth the path. Just you choosing yourself because you deserve better. I know this seems cruel. Maybe it is. But I'd rather you hate me and be free than love me and repeat my mistakes. When you're ready, when you've passed this test, Thaddeus will help you claim what's yours. Until then, live small if you must, but live true. All my love. Mom. Nora had read that letter so many times the creases had worn soft as fabric. She'd been 24 then, raw with grief and rage at a mother who'd left her instructions instead of comfort. But she'd followed them anyway because some part of her understood that Vivian Ashford hadn't been punishing her, she'd been protecting her. Meeting Marcus 1 year later had felt like fate offering her a test she hadn't asked for but needed to pass. He'd been charming at first, attentive in ways that felt like balm on wounds still healing from her mother's death and Owen's father's abandonment. When Marcus proposed after only 6 months, when he'd smiled and said he didn't mind taking on another man's child, Nora had almost convinced herself she'd found something real. The signs appeared slowly. Little dismissals that seemed harmless in isolation, suggesting she skipped book club because the women there were a bit much, mentioning she might look better if she lost a few pounds, pointing out she'd misunderstood something obvious when she knew she hadn't. By the 2nd year, she was editing herself, constantly making herself smaller in all the ways her mother had warned against. By the 3rd year, she'd caught him looking at her with something like contempt. By the 5th, she'd started planning. The code had been almost accidental at first, just something to occupy her mind during the long evenings when Marcus worked late, or claimed he did. She'd always had an aptitude for systems, and patterns had earned her Ph.D. in computer science before Owen was born, before everything had fallen apart, and she'd needed to disappear into a simpler identity. Writing software felt like breathing natural and necessary, and the neural mesh architecture she'd developed over 18 months of late nights represented some of her best work. She'd never planned to show it to Marcus. But then he'd come home one night, stressed about a failing product line at Helix Dynamics, and she'd made the mistake of suggesting a solution. He'd looked at her like she'd spoken a foreign language, then laughed. "Since when do you understand AI architecture?" "I took some courses, before Owen." The lie came easily practiced. "Well, it's cute that you're interested, but this is pretty advanced stuff." 2 weeks later, she'd left her laptop open on the kitchen table, the neural mesh code displayed on the screen. She'd watched through the bedroom doorway as Marcus scrolled through it, his expression shifting from curiosity to calculation. When he'd returned to bed that night, he'd kissed her forehead and told her the product meeting went well. The next day, she'd found traces of her files copied to a USB drive she didn't own. That was 3 years ago. Since then, she'd been methodical. Every piece of code Marcus stole, she documented. Every contractor he hired to finish work he claimed to have started, she tracked. And 3 years ago, using her real name, Eleanor Ashford, she'd filed patents for the entire neural mesh architecture through a law firm in Boston that specialized in intellectual property. Marcus had never thought to check. Why would he? Nora Mitchell was a struggling freelance writer who understood basic HTML at best. She wasn't someone who could build the foundation for a company's flagship product. She wasn't someone worth investigating. The IPO prospectus for Helix Dynamics sat in a folder on her phone downloaded from the SEC's public filings. She'd read it twice, marking the sections where Synapse Core Marcus's revolutionary achievement was described in language lifted almost verbatim from her original white papers. The valuation was projected at $600 million. Marcus's stock options would be worth $12 million once the offering closed. He'd built his futures on her work, and he had no idea she'd been letting him. Owen's voice pulled her back to the present. "Mom, are you okay?" She turned from the window, found him watching her with concerned eyes. "I'm good, baby. Just thinking." "About Marcus. About tomorrow. I have a meeting." This was true. Thaddeus Sterling had scheduled lunch at a restaurant in Midtown, the kind of place where power brokers met over expensive wine and agreed to things that would never be written down. Nora had been to hundreds of such places before her mother died, back when being Vivian Ashford's daughter meant automatic access to rooms that would now view Nora Mitchell as staff. "Who are you meeting?" "An old family friend. Very boring adult stuff." Owen accepted this and returned to his homework. Nora moved to the small kitchen area, started water boiling for pasta they'd eat with jarred sauce and frozen vegetables. The routine of cooking in a space barely large enough to turn around felt oddly comforting, like putting on clothes that fit better than she'd remembered. Her phone buzzed again. This time a message from Celeste Vaughn's Instagram account, which Nora had been monitoring through a fake profile for the past 3 months. The post showed Marcus and Celeste at some upscale restaurant, her hand resting on his forearm, both of them laughing at something off camera. The caption read, "Celebrating New Beginnings." Nora studied the image for a long moment. Celeste was beautiful in the way Marcus preferred polished, expensive-looking, the kind of woman whose appearance communicated ambition. She was also based on the digital trail she'd left a junior marketing executive at Helix Dynamics with a degree from a decent but not exceptional state school and enough student debt to make her vulnerable to a man with money and promises. 3 weeks ago, Celeste had sent a work email at 2 in the morning asking Marcus to review product documentation. The time-stamp coincided with Marcus telling Nora he was working late at the office. 2 weeks ago, Celeste had posted a photo of a wine glass at the same restaurant where Marcus claimed to be meeting investors. 1 week ago, she'd been tagged at a hotel bar in Midtown at 11 p.m. on a Tuesday. Nora wondered if Celeste knew about the code theft or if she was simply another person Marcus had convinced that he was more than he actually was. The thought made her sad in a distant way, like hearing about tragedy in a country she'd never visit. She set her phone aside and focused on dinner, on Owen's chatter about his day at school, on the simple mechanics of life in a studio apartment that cost a fraction of what Marcus's penthouse required. This was the final phase, the part her mother's letter had promised would hurt most. Living in the space between who she'd pretended to be and who she actually was, waiting for the moment when the gap closed and Eleanor Ashford could step back into the light. That night, after Owen fell asleep in his small room with action figures standing guard on the windowsill, Nora sat at the kitchen table with her laptop. The screen's glow illuminated her face in the darkness as she opened secure folders that Marcus would never have suspected existed on the device he'd seen her use for nothing more sophisticated than writing blog posts about parenting. Financial records, patent filings, code repositories with timestamps that predated Marcus's claimed invention by 18 months. Email chains with contractors who'd questioned the architecture Marcus presented, noting the sophistication suggested a team of developers, not a single product manager working nights and weekends. And one more thing, share certificates for Helix Dynamics purchased over the past 2 years through a shell company called Mitchell Holdings LLC. 30% of this company acquired quietly through private sales from early investors looking to cash out before the IPO. The purchases had been handled by a venture capital firm that specialized in discrete investments, structured in a way that wouldn't appear on any shareholder list Marcus would think to check. Eleanor Ashford had learned many things from watching her mother navigate the world of serious money. The most important was that real power made itself invisible until the moment it chose otherwise. She closed the laptop and moved to the window, looking out at a city that held 8 million stories and cared about none of them individually. Somewhere across Manhattan, Marcus was probably in bed with Celeste, celebrating his freedom and his impending fortune. He was probably thinking about the IPO roadshow, the investors who'd praised his innovation, the future where he'd finally have the respect he felt he deserved. He wasn't thinking about Nora Mitchell at all, which was exactly what she'd been counting on. The radiator clanked and hissed, fighting against February's cold. Nora pulled her cardigan tighter and allowed herself the smallest smile. Her mother had been right about almost everything. Love shouldn't make you smaller. Sacrifice shouldn't feel like slow erasure. And freedom, when it finally came, should be something you claimed for yourself, not something given by the person who tried to take it away. In 6 weeks, the Ashford Global Trust annual charity gala would take place at the Plaza Hotel. 500 guests, including every major player in New York's financial and tech sectors, media coverage that would reach millions, and one announcement that would change everything Marcus thought he knew about the woman he'd dismissed as too simple to matter. Nora turned away from the window and went to check on Owen one last time. He slept deeply, his face peaceful in the amber glow from the street lamp outside. She adjusted his blanket and brushed hair from his forehead, feeling the fierce protectiveness that had defined her life since the moment he was born. "Almost there, baby," she whispered. "Almost free." 2 months after the divorce, Marcus Barrett's life looked exactly like the vision board he'd stopped making after business school taught him manifestation was for people who couldn't execute strategy. The corner office at Helix Dynamics had his name on a placard that caught morning light, and the view stretched across lower Manhattan like proof of concept. Celeste had moved into the penthouse completely now, replacing the last traces of Nora's minimalist aesthetic with curated pieces that appeared in design magazines, a credenza from Milan, abstract art that cost more than most people's cars, throw pillows in jewel tones that demanded to be photographed. The IPO roadshow had exceeded projections. Investors in Boston, Chicago, and San Francisco had leaned forward during his presentations about Synapse Core, asking questions he'd prepared for, and some he'd improvised answers to with the confidence of someone who believed his own mythology. The technology was revolutionary, he'd told rooms full of venture capitalists and institutional investors. Neural mesh architecture that could predict user behavior with 93% accuracy, adaptable across industries from healthcare to finance to security systems. He'd built it from the ground up, starting in his apartment during nights and weekends when lesser men were watching television or sleeping. Nobody asked why a product manager with no formal computer science training had suddenly produced enterprise-level AI architecture. They looked at his trajectory, state school to decent MBA to Helix executive, and saw the American story they wanted to believe. Genius could come from anywhere. Ambition mattered more than pedigree. Innovation didn't require credentials if you were smart enough and hungry enough and willing to do the work nobody else would. The IPO was scheduled for April 26, 10 weeks away. Helix's valuation had climbed to $640 million in the latest prospectus revision. Marcus's stock options vested over 4 years, but accelerated upon the public offering would be worth $12.3 million the moment trading opened. He'd already started looking at property in the Hamptons, places with water access and enough land that his neighbors wouldn't be close enough to matter. Celeste leaned against his office doorframe holding 2 cups of coffee from the place downstairs that charged $7 for foam art. She wore a dress that probably cost what Nora used to spend on groceries for a month, and her hair was styled in a way that looked effortless but required a standing appointment at a salon Marcus had started paying for without being asked. "Ready for the board meeting?" He accepted the coffee, tasting the exact amount of cream he preferred. Celeste paid attention to details like that, remembered how he took his coffee, which restaurants he liked, when to speak up in meetings, and when to let his ideas land without competition. She made him look better by proximity, which was its own kind of intelligence. "Reynolds wants to talk about the SEC filing. Routine questions about code provenance." Her expression shifted slightly, a micro-expression he'd learned to read over their months together. Concern, or maybe something adjacent to it. "Have you ever had anyone verify the development timeline the attorneys keep asking about documentation?" "It's handled. I have commit logs going back 2 years. This wasn't technically a lie. The commits existed time-stamped and saved in repositories that showed Marcus Barrett as the author of Synapse Core's foundational code. What the logs didn't show was the 18 months of architecture that predated his involvement. The original white papers that sketched the neural mesh concept, or the fact that every sophisticated piece of the system had appeared on his laptop after convenient file transfers from a source he'd stopped thinking about. Nora had left that laptop on the kitchen table so many times, always open to code that seemed beyond her skill level but never quite impossible given her claim about taking some courses. Marcus had initially copied the files out of curiosity, then continued because she never seemed to notice, and eventually because the architecture was genuinely brilliant, and Helix desperately needed something innovative to justify its valuation. By the time he'd realized how much of Synapse Core relied on her work, he'd already presented it to the executive team as his own innovation. Walking it back would have meant admitting theft, and Marcus had convinced himself that wasn't what this was. Nora had been his wife. What was hers was his, legally speaking, even if the prenup said otherwise, and she'd left the files accessible, practically inviting him to use them. If she'd valued the work, she would have protected it better. The fact that she hadn't suggested she didn't understand its worth, which meant she didn't deserve the credit. This logic had worked well enough for 3 years that Marcus had stopped examining it. Celeste set her coffee on his desk, her perfectly manicured nails tapping against the ceramic. "There's something I need to tell you." The shift in her tone made him look up from the market reports he'd been skimming. Her face carried an expression he couldn't immediately categorize. Not quite worry, not quite guilt, but something in that family of emotions. "I've been going through the code repository for the marketing materials." "Okay." "Some of the comments in the original files have initials that aren't yours. NM. And there are algorithm notes signed EA, with references to something called the Ashford Protocol." Marcus felt his jaw tighten, an involuntary response his body produced before his mind caught up. "Contractors use initials. Stephen from the old dev team probably. Stephen's last name is Kumar, and EA doesn't match anyone in our employment records going back 6 years. The silence that followed had texture thick enough that Marcus could feel it pressing against his throat. Celeste waited, her expression open but expectant, and he realized she wasn't accusing him of anything yet. She was asking for an explanation that would let her continue not asking harder questions. Those were early consultants, no longer with the company. The Ashford thing is just a naming convention, probably from some framework they used. It doesn't mean anything. Celeste's shoulders relaxed fractionally, and Marcus understood he'd threaded the needle, given her enough explanation to quiet the doubt without providing details she might investigate. She wanted to believe him. That was the advantage of dating someone whose career benefited from his success. Her skepticism had limits, boundaries defined by self-interest. "Okay. I just wanted to make sure there weren't any IP issues before we go public. The last thing we need is someone claiming they contributed to Synapse Core. Nobody's going to claim anything. The code is documented. I'm listed as the primary architect. End of story." She smiled, apparently satisfied, and left to prepare for the board meeting. Marcus sat alone in his office, staring at the Manhattan skyline without seeing it. The initials hadn't occurred to him as a problem because he'd stopped thinking of Nora as someone who required consideration. But now that Celeste had mentioned them, he couldn't unsee the pattern: hundreds of code comments marked with initials that definitely weren't his, spread across files that formed Synapse Core's foundational architecture. He opened his laptop and pulled up the repository, searching for EA in the comment history. The results populated faster than he expected: 184 instances across 37 files. Most were technical notes about optimization or security considerations, the kind of thing a senior developer would leave for their future self. But a few stood out. EA. Recursive learning pattern here could improve prediction accuracy 15 to 20%. See dissertation chapter 4. EA. Auth layer vulnerability. Critical patch required before any deployment. EA. Refactor needed. Current approach won't scale past 10,000 concurrent users. Each comment was dated, and Marcus felt something cold settle in his stomach as he traced the timestamps backward. The earliest EA comment was from 4 years ago, 18 months before he'd claimed to start working on Synapse Core. The sophistication of the notes suggested someone with deep expertise in AI architecture, someone who referenced their own dissertation like they'd written foundational research. He searched for Ashford Protocol, next found references in 3 core files. The term appeared in comments describing a particular approach to neural mesh optimization, something about recursive pattern analysis that allowed the system to improve its predictions over time without manual retraining. It was, Marcus realized with growing unease, the exact feature that made Synapse Core revolutionary, the thing investors kept pointing to as Helix's competitive advantage. His phone buzzed. A calendar reminder: board meeting in 15 minutes. Marcus closed the laptop and stood straightening his tie and rolling his shoulders back in a gesture he'd practiced until it looked natural. Whatever questions the code comments raised, they didn't matter. Nora Mitchell didn't have patents. She didn't have legal representation. She'd signed the divorce papers without fighting for anything, which meant she either didn't know what she'd contributed or didn't care. Either way, she wasn't a threat. He checked his reflection in the window glass, saw the man he'd worked to become successful, confident, on the verge of generational wealth. The man who'd escaped a marriage that was holding him back and found a partner who elevated him instead. The man who definitely hadn't built his entire future on stolen work from a wife he'd systematically devalued until she'd stopped believing in her own competence. The board meeting lasted 90 minutes and resolved nothing Marcus couldn't have handled via email. Reynolds droned about fiduciary responsibilities and SEC compliance. The CFO presented projections that assumed everything would go according to plan, and Marcus gave his standard update on product development, emphasizing the revolutionary nature of Synapse Core's architecture while carefully avoiding technical specifics that might expose gaps in his knowledge. Afterward, he returned to his office to find an envelope on his desk. Thick, cream-colored paper, his name written in elegant script across the front. No return address, but the weight and quality suggested someone with money behind it. Inside, an invitation printed on cardstock that probably cost more per sheet than most people spent on birthday cards. Ashford Global Trust, Annual Charity Gala, April 15th, 7:00 p.m., the Plaza Hotel, Grand Ballroom, black tie. Below that, in smaller text, as a valued member of New York's technology community, your presence is requested. Marcus set the invitation aside, mildly flattered but mostly indifferent. Charity galas were networking opportunities dressed up as altruism, and he'd learned to work them efficiently, arrive fashionably, late target 3 high-value contacts, make an impression, leave before the speeches got tedious. The Ashford name meant nothing to him, though the Plaza venue suggested serious money behind the organization. He texted Celeste, "We have a gala April 15th. Need to get you something appropriate." Her response came immediately, "Already have the perfect dress. This will be good for us." Marcus smiled at the us construction, the way she'd naturally folded their professional and personal lives into a single trajectory. Nora had never thought that way, had actively resisted being seen as part of his career, insisting she didn't belong at industry events, making excuses about childcare or not having the right clothes. He'd eventually stopped inviting her, stopped mentioning the parties and dinners and networking opportunities that defined upward mobility in tech. Her absence had made everything easier. The next 2 weeks passed in the compressed time of momentum building toward something inevitable. The IPO roadshow continued. Marcus gave interviews to industry publications about innovation and disruption and the importance of taking calculated risks. Celeste appeared in the background of some photos, beautiful and polished, and exactly the kind of partner who made other men envious. The Helix Dynamics stock price in the gray market climbed as anticipation built, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, small irregularities began appearing. First, a call from the company's IP attorney asking about documentation for Synapse Core's development history. Marcus sent the commit logs, emphasized his role as primary architect, and thought nothing of it until the attorney called back 3 days later. "We've received an inquiry from the SEC. Routine stuff, just verifying there are no existing patents that might conflict with the technology we're claiming as proprietary." Marcus kept his voice level. "There aren't. I developed the core architecture independently." "Right. And we've documented that. But the SEC is being thorough this cycle, apparently. They want to see any prior art academic papers, anything that might have influenced the development. I'll pull together what I have." He hung up and immediately opened his browser, searching for patents related to neural mesh architecture and AI prediction systems. The results populated slowly, each entry a minor relief. Nothing that looked similar enough to matter, nothing filed by anyone he recognized. He expanded the search to include academic papers, found dozens, but none that preceded his work on Synapse Core. Then on page 3 of results, something made his breath catch: Recursive Neural Mesh Optimization for Predictive Behavioral Modeling. Author E.A. Ashford. Institution MIT. Published 4 years prior. Provisional patent filed 3 years prior. Marcus clicked through, his pulse accelerating. The paper was technical dense with mathematical notation and architectural diagrams, but the core concept was unmistakable. It described the Ashford Protocol in precise academic language, the exact methodology that made Synapse Core revolutionary. The author bio was brief. E.A. Ashford is a doctoral candidate specializing in artificial intelligence and neural network architecture. No photo, no full first name, just initials and a surname. Ashford, like the charity gala invitation sitting on his desk, like the protocol name in the code comments. He searched for E.A. Ashford MIT and found an alumni directory listing Eleanor Ashford graduated 8 years ago with highest honors dissertation focused on recursive neural networks. The university had a placeholder photo from some academic conference. The image quality was poor. The woman's face turned partially away from the camera, but something about the profile seemed distantly familiar in a way Marcus couldn't place. He searched for Eleanor Ashford, New York, and found very little, a few mentions in old society pages from a decade ago showing a young woman at charity events always photographed beside someone named Vivian Ashford. He searched for Vivian, next found an obituary from 8 years ago. Vivian Eleanor Ashford, philanthropist and founder of Ashford Global Trust, died at age 54. She is survived by her daughter Eleanor. The pieces were assembling themselves, but Marcus's mind kept rejecting the connections they were trying to form. Eleanor Ashford had written the foundational paper that Synapse Core was built on. Eleanor Ashford's mother had created the trust hosting the charity gala. And E.A. in the code comments stood for, his phone rang. Celeste. Hey, this is going to sound strange, but I've been trying to find your ex-wife on social media. Just curious, don't ask. But I can't find anything under Nora Mitchell. Like nothing. No Facebook, no LinkedIn, no digital footprint before 7 years ago. The floor seemed to tilt. Marcus gripped the edge of his desk. Why are you looking for her? I don't know. I guess I wanted to see what she looked like. You never had photos of her displayed, and I was curious about who you were with before me. Celeste paused. But then I found something weird. I searched old MIT alumni records for computer science PhDs around the right time period, and there's a dissertation abstract from 9 years ago by someone named Eleanor Ashford. The research topic matches Synapse Core almost exactly. That's a coincidence. Marcus, the dissertation includes a photo. It's her. It's Nora. Same face, just younger, with darker hair worn long instead of in that bun she always had. Everything Marcus had been holding separate in his mind collapsed into a single point of terrible clarity. The room felt too small suddenly, the air too thin. His voice came out rougher than he intended. You're sure? Positive. Same person. The caption says Eleanor Nora Ashford, like Nora was a nickname she went by. Celeste's tone shifted, uncertainty creeping in. Marcus, why would she use a fake last name when you met her? And why wouldn't you know she had a PhD from MIT? Because she'd told him she was Nora Mitchell, a freelance writer who'd taken some courses before having Owen. Because she'd presented herself as someone simple and unambitious, someone grateful for his support and understanding about her modest circumstances. Because she'd made herself invisible in all the ways that mattered, and he'd been arrogant enough to believe the performance was reality. I need to call you back. He ended the call before Celeste could ask more questions and sat in his office as the truth assembled itself with merciless precision. Nora Mitchell was Eleanor Ashford. Eleanor Ashford had written the academic paper that described Synapse Core's architecture 3 years before he'd invented it. The Ashford Protocol wasn't a random naming convention, it was literally named after its creator, and the charity gala he'd been planning to attend as a networking opportunity was hosted by a trust created by Eleanor's mother. Eleanor hadn't accidentally left her laptop open. She hadn't been careless with sophisticated code because she didn't understand its value. She'd been setting a trap, letting him take exactly enough rope to hang himself, and he'd been too self-absorbed to notice he was being tested. The next call came within the hour. Patricia Chen Helix's general counsel, her voice carrying the clipped precision of someone managing a crisis. Marcus, We have a problem. The SEC inquiry just escalated. They've found a provisional patent for neural mesh optimization technology filed 3 years ago by someone named Eleanor Ashford. The patent describes methodology that's identical to Synapse Core's core functionality. Marcus closed his eyes. I know. You know? Patricia's tone sharpened. How long have you known? I just found out. Eleanor Ashford is my ex-wife. The silence on the other end lasted 3 seconds that felt like minutes. When Patricia spoke again, her voice had shifted into emergency mode. Your ex-wife developed the technology and you didn't disclose this when you presented Synapse Core to the board. She was working on academic research during our marriage. You thought marital property laws meant you could appropriate her doctoral work without attribution or compensation. Patricia cut him off. Marcus, that's not how intellectual property works, and you know it. Did she ever give you explicit permission to use her research commercially? He scrolled through years of mental archives and found no conversation that would support that claim. Nora had never discussed her work with him in any detail. She'd never offered to collaborate. And the one time she'd suggested an optimization to his work, he'd dismissed it as amateur enthusiasm. No documented permission. Then we're in serious trouble. I'm calling an emergency board meeting for tomorrow morning. You need to prepare yourself for difficult questions about how you acquired this technology. The board meeting the next morning had the atmosphere of a funeral where everyone suspected murder. Reynolds sat at the head of the conference table looking like he'd aged 5 years overnight. The CFO kept adjusting his glasses like he couldn't quite bring the numbers into focus. Patricia presented the situation with surgical precision. Provisional patent filed 3 years ago. SEC inquiry. No documentation of legitimate IP transfer potential exposure running into hundreds of millions if they proceeded with the IPO and faced litigation. Walk us through how you developed Synapse Core. Reynolds looked directly at Marcus, and the question wasn't really a question. Marcus felt the weight of 6 board members' attention focus like a spotlight. I began working on the architecture about 3 years ago. The core concept came from research I'd been doing independently. Research based on what foundation? General AI principles, industry best practices, some optimization techniques I'd learned over the years. Patricia slid a document across the table. This is Eleanor Ashford's doctoral dissertation from MIT published 4 years ago. It describes recursive neural mesh optimization using methodology that's architecturally identical to Synapse Core. Did you have access to this research? My ex-wife mentioned she'd done some graduate work. I didn't know the specifics. The CFO leaned forward. But you lived with someone who had this expertise and suddenly you produced technology in her exact area of specialization without acknowledging her contribution. Marcus felt the narrative being rewritten around him, his achievement being reframed as theft. She left her work accessible. I thought I had implicit permission to build on it. Reynolds removed his glasses. Implicit permission isn't a legal standard, Marcus. Did she know you were using her research to build a commercial product? We didn't discuss it explicitly. That's a no. Reynolds looked at Patricia. What's our exposure? Conservatively $100 million in damages if she sues. Complete devaluation of the company. Possible criminal charges for securities fraud if we knowingly took a company public using stolen IP, and that's assuming she doesn't ask for an injunction preventing us from using the technology at all. The room fell silent. Marcus watched his future evaporate in real time. The stock options, the Hampton house, the version of himself that was successful and respected and worth Celeste's attention. All of it built on a foundation that had been crumbling since the moment Eleanor left her laptop open, and he'd convinced himself that taking what he found there wasn't theft. Reynolds stood. Marcus, you're suspended effective immediately pending investigation. Patricia, reach out to Ms. Ashford's legal representation and see if we can negotiate a resolution. Everyone else, absolute silence on this until we know what we're dealing with. Marcus walked out of the boardroom into a silence that felt permanent. His assistant wouldn't meet his eyes. The other executives suddenly had urgent business elsewhere. Celeste stood outside his office, her face carefully neutral but her posture suggesting she'd already heard. "Are you okay?" He almost laughed. "No." "What happens now?" "I wait to see if Eleanor decides to destroy me completely or just take most of what I thought I'd earned." Celeste's hand found his arm, but the gesture felt mechanical rather than comforting. "Maybe if you explain that it was a misunderstanding." "It wasn't a misunderstanding. I took her life's work and told everyone it was mine. There's no framing that makes me look anything but exactly what I am." He started packing his office, putting 7 years of accumulated success into boxes that security would inspect before letting him leave. Photos with other executives' awards for innovation, the nameplate from his door, all of it props from a play that had just been revealed as plagiarism. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "Mr. Barrett, this is Thaddeus Sterling, attorney for Eleanor Ashford. We should speak before the charity gala on Friday. Would you be available tomorrow at 2 p.m.? My office is at 600 Lexington Avenue." Marcus stared at the message, understanding that this wasn't an invitation so much as a summons. He typed back, "I'll be there." The response came immediately. "Ms. Ashford looks forward to clarifying a few matters." The word clarifying carried implications that made Marcus's chest tighten. Eleanor wasn't just going to expose his theft. She was going to explain exactly how thoroughly he'd been played, and he had no choice but to sit there and listen while she dismantled every assumption he'd made about who held power in their relationship. He finished packing as the afternoon light stretched across his former office. Celeste had disappeared somewhere, probably processing the revelation that her boyfriend had built his career on stolen intellectual property from a woman he'd spent years dismissing as intellectually unremarkable. The building felt different now, or maybe Marcus felt different in it, like he'd been walking through a house of mirrors, and someone had just turned on the lights to reveal how distorted every reflection had been. Tomorrow he would go to Thaddeus Sterling's office and learn the full scope of what Eleanor had been planning while he'd been congratulating himself on escaping a marriage to someone too simple to appreciate his ambition. Tomorrow he would discover exactly how much it cost to build yourself on someone else's foundation and think you'd gotten away with it. Tonight he sat in an empty office that no longer bore his name and understood with perfect clarity that everything he'd thought he'd built had been borrowed from someone he'd never actually seen. And the real punishment wasn't that Eleanor was taking it back. It was that she'd let him believe it was his in the first place, knowing exactly when and how the illusion would shatter. Thaddeus Sterling's office occupied the penthouse floor of a building constructed when Manhattan still believed in permanence over spectacle. The elevator opened directly into a reception area where afternoon light slanted through windows that had witnessed 80 years of history condensing into contracts and trusts and the quiet machinery of generational wealth. Marcus stepped onto marble floors that had been installed before his grandparents were born and felt immediately out of place in a way that had nothing to do with his suspended employment status. The receptionist, a man in his 60s who carried himself like he'd been screening visitors since the Carter administration, gestured toward a hallway lined with oil portraits of men in suits that predated modern tailoring. "Mr. Sterling is expecting you. Last door on the right." Marcus walked past paintings of faces that all shared the same expression of casual certainty, the look of people who'd never questioned their right to occupy space. The hallway ended at a door made of wood so dark it seemed to absorb light. He knocked once, heard a voice tell him to enter. Thaddeus Sterling stood behind a desk that could have doubled as a landing strip, his silver hair catching the sun in a way that made him look like he'd been cast for the role of distinguished attorney rather than having grown into it naturally. But it was the woman sitting in the chair facing the desk who made Marcus forget how to breathe. Eleanor. Not Nora in a cardigan and jeans, hair pulled back in a style meant to minimize rather than enhance, but Eleanor Ashford in a navy suit that had been tailored to precision and probably cost more than the penthouse rent Marcus could no longer afford. Her hair fell loose past her shoulders in dark waves he'd never seen because she'd always worn it scraped into that apologetic bun. She looked younger than she had during their marriage, or maybe just less tired, and when she met his eyes there was no warmth in the expression, but no anger either, just the cool assessment of someone evaluating an equation that needed solving. "Marcus, thank you for coming." Her voice carried none of the soft uncertainty he remembered, none of the trailing off quality that had always made her sound like she was apologizing for speaking. This voice belonged to someone accustomed to being heard. Thaddeus gestured to the chair beside Eleanor. "Please sit. We have quite a bit to discuss." Marcus lowered himself into leather that probably cost more than his first car, trying to process the cognitive dissonance of seeing Nora Eleanor in an environment that screamed old money and established power. Everything about this room, from the first edition law books lining the walls to the antique globe in the corner, communicated that the people who occupied this space made decisions that affected other people's lives. "I assume you've had time to review the situation with Helix Dynamics." Thaddeus opened a folder and slid it across the desk. Marcus recognized the SEC inquiry paperwork, the provisional patent filing documentation he'd seen in yesterday's emergency board meeting. But there were additional pages underneath something that looked like corporate share certificates. "That's Mitchell Holdings, LLC." Thaddeus tapped the certificates with one finger. "A shell company established 3 years ago to make private investments in promising technology firms. Mitchell Holdings currently owns 30% of Helix Dynamics, acquired through purchases from early investors who wanted liquidity before the IPO. The information landed like a punch Marcus saw coming but couldn't dodge. 30%. Making Ms. Ashford the largest single shareholder in the company you've been running. Well, we're running. I understand your suspension was announced yesterday." Marcus looked at Eleanor, searching for some trace of the woman who'd signed divorce papers without asking for anything. "You've been buying into Helix for 3 years. 2.5, technically. I needed to be certain about a few things first." Her tone was conversational, almost pleasant, and that made it worse somehow. She wasn't gloating or posturing. She was simply stating facts. "Certain about what?" "That you'd actually use my code. That you'd present it as your own innovation rather than acknowledging where it came from. That you'd build your entire professional future on intellectual property you'd stolen from someone you considered too simple to notice." The words were delivered without heat, which made them cut deeper. Marcus felt his face flush. "I didn't think of it as stealing. We were married. I thought—" "You thought marital property laws meant you could take my life's work and claim credit for it?" Eleanor leaned forward slightly, and something in her posture reminded him of a chess player who'd been planning 3 moves ahead since the game began. "Or you thought I was too unsophisticated to understand intellectual property rights." "I thought you didn't care. You never said anything. You left your laptop open constantly, practically inviting me to look at what you were working on." "I did invite you. I wanted to see what kind of person you were when you thought no one was watching." The admission hung between them like evidence presented to a jury. Marcus understood then that nothing about their marriage had been what he'd believed. Not her passivity, not her simple ambitions, not her willingness to accept his dismissiveness as if she deserved nothing better. She'd been running an experiment, and he'd been the subject too arrogant to realize he was being observed. Thaddeus cleared his throat. "Ms. Ashford has asked me to present you with 2 options, Mr. Barrett. The first is negotiation. We can structure a licensing agreement where Helix pays for the use of her patented technology, along with appropriate attribution and compensation for the past 3 years of unlicensed use. The IPO proceeds as scheduled, you avoid criminal charges, and everyone moves forward with their respective futures intact." Marcus felt hope flicker weakly. "And the second option?" "Ms. Ashford exercises her rights as majority shareholder to call for your immediate termination and permanent removal from the company. She then files suit for intellectual property theft, seeking damages equal to the full value of Synapse Core, which our analysts estimate at approximately $400 million. The IPO collapses, Helix faces bankruptcy, and you face potential criminal prosecution for fraud." The hope guttered out. Marcus looked at Eleanor, really looked at her for the first time in years, and saw a stranger wearing the face of someone he'd thought he knew. "Why even offer the first option if you hate me that much?" "I don't hate you, Marcus. Hate requires caring about someone's existence, and I stopped caring about yours the day I signed those divorce papers." She pulled a document from her bag, unfolded it on the desk between them. "This is the settlement you were so pleased I signed without reading. The one where I asked for nothing because I supposedly had nothing worth fighting for." Marcus scanned the pages, saw his signature at the bottom beside hers, remembered the satisfaction he'd felt at how easily she'd capitulated. Nothing in the language jumped out as unusual standard divorce boilerplate about asset division and waiver of claims. Eleanor's finger pointed to a clause buried in the third page. "Here, mutual waiver of present and future claims arising from fiduciary interests, trusts, or beneficial control associated with the named spouse. You signed away any claim to anything connected to me, Marcus, not just current assets but future interests, which includes the Ashford Global Trust that activated the day our divorce was finalized. I don't understand. My mother died 8 years ago and left me everything, $8.7 billion held in trust with conditions attached. The main condition was that I couldn't inherit while legally bound to someone who diminished my sense of self-worth. I had to prove I could walk away from a toxic relationship without using money as leverage." The pieces were assembling themselves into a picture that made Marcus feel like he was falling from a great height. "You married me as some kind of test. I married you because I wanted to believe people could change, that someone who started out charming and attentive might stay that way, instead of revealing that the charm was just performance and the attention was just control." Eleanor's voice remained steady, but something flickered in her expression, not quite pain but the memory of it. "You failed that test incrementally over 7 years of small cruelties that added up to a comprehensive portrait of who you actually are." Thaddeus interjected before Marcus could respond. "The intellectual property theft was incidental to the moral test, but it did provide useful documentation of pattern and intent. Every file you copied, every contractor you hired to finish work, you claim to have started every interview where you took credit for innovation. You didn't create all of it documented and time-stamped." Marcus felt the walls closing in the carefully constructed narrative of his success, collapsing under the weight of evidence he'd never imagined existed. "So what do you want, money, public humiliation to watch me lose everything I've built?" "What I want is for you to understand that what you built was never yours to begin with." Eleanor stood, and Marcus found himself standing too, some instinct from childhood about standing when a woman stands kicking in despite everything. "You built a career on my work, a reputation on my innovation, a future on my intellectual property, and you did it while making me feel like I should be grateful you tolerated my presence in your life. I didn't make you feel anything. You chose to stay. I did choose to stay. For 7 years I chose to endure your condescension and your casual cruelty and your systematic erosion of my confidence. Do you know why?" Marcus shook his head, throat too tight for words. "Because my mother taught me that strength isn't about fighting back immediately. It's about knowing when to wait, when to gather evidence, when to let someone reveal exactly who they are before you show them what you're capable of." She collected her bag, moved toward the door with grace Marcus had never associated with Nora Mitchell. "I'm offering you the licensing agreement because destroying you completely would hurt people who don't deserve it. Helix employees who had nothing to do with your theft, investors who trusted your claims, even Celeste, who's guilty of nothing except believing your lies." The mention of Celeste's name made him flinch. Eleanor noticed. "She called me yesterday. Did you know that wanted to warn me that you were planning to fight the patent claim, that you were going to argue we'd jointly developed the technology during our marriage?" Eleanor paused in the doorway, and for the first time something like pity crossed her face. "I told her the truth, all of it, how you'd systematically stolen my work, how you'd presented it as your own innovation, how you'd built your relationship with her on the foundation of lies you'd told yourself so often you'd started to believe them." Marcus felt the ground shift beneath him. "What did she say?" "She thanked me for the honesty and hung up. I imagine you'll be hearing from her soon, though probably not in the way you're hoping." Eleanor left then, her footsteps receding down the hallway lined with portraits of men who'd made fortunes by being smarter and more ruthless than their opponents. Thaddeus remained behind his desk, watching Marcus with the expression of someone who'd seen this play out many times before and knew all the possible endings. "You have until tomorrow morning to decide. Take the licensing agreement, acknowledge Ms. Ashford's contribution publicly, and move forward with what's left of your career. Or fight this and lose everything in a legal battle you cannot win." He slid a business card across the desk. "My direct line. I'll be available until midnight tonight if you have questions." Marcus took the card and walked out into afternoon light that seemed too bright, too indifferent to the way his entire understanding of the past 7 years had just been rewritten. The elevator descended 43 floors, and with each passing number, Marcus replayed moments he'd dismissed as insignificant. Nora leaving her laptop open. Nora suggesting technical improvements he'd ignored. Nora signing divorce papers without fighting, Nora walking away from their marriage like it was a coat she'd outgrown rather than a relationship worth salvaging. She'd been playing a game he hadn't known existed, and he'd lost before he'd realized he was competing. His phone buzzed as he stepped onto the street. A text from Celeste. "We need to talk. I'm at the apartment." Marcus flagged a taxi, gave the driver the address of the penthouse that was still in his name for another 2 weeks until the lease required renewal. The ride uptown took 30 minutes in traffic that moved like sludge, and he spent the time trying to formulate explanations that would make Celeste understand he wasn't the villain Eleanor had painted him as. But every defense he constructed crumbled under the weight of facts he couldn't dispute. He'd taken Eleanor's code without permission. He'd claimed credit for innovation he hadn't created. He'd built his professional success on theft, and he'd done it while systematically devaluing the person he'd stolen from until she'd seemed to forget her own worth. The truth was ugly, and there was no framing that made it less so. Celeste was packing when he entered the apartment. Not frantically, not emotionally, just methodically transferring her belongings from the spaces they'd occupied into luggage that suggested she'd already made decisions about what came next. She looked up when he closed the door, and her face carried the particular exhaustion of someone who'd been crying, but was finished now. "Eleanor called me." Marcus set his keys on the counter, felt the gesture's finality. "I know. She told me." "Is it true, all of it?" "It's more complicated than she made it sound." Celeste stopped packing, and the look she gave him could have stripped paint. "Is it true that you stole her code and presented it as your own innovation?" The question demanded a yes or no answer, and Marcus found he couldn't force the lie through his teeth. "Yes. Is it true that you knew she was brilliant, that she had a PhD from MIT, that the work you claimed to have invented was actually her life's research?" "I didn't know about the PhD until recently, and I genuinely thought that you could take credit for someone else's work because you were married to them, that her intelligence somehow belonged to you because you shared a bed." Celeste zipped her suitcase with enough force that the sound echoed. "I defended you, Marcus. When people whispered that you weren't technical enough to have built Synapse Core, I told them they were being jealous. When the board started asking questions, I convinced myself there must be a reasonable explanation. There is an explanation. We were married. The lines were blurred about whose work was whose. The lines were never blurred. You just decided to ignore them because it was convenient." She pulled her second suitcase from the closet, started filling it with the designer shoes Marcus had enjoyed buying for her because they made her look successful, and successful-looking partners reflected well on him. "Eleanor told me something else, too, about how you used to talk about her after she left. How you'd say she was lucky you'd supported her for so long, how you'd imply she wouldn't survive without you." Marcus felt heat creep up his neck. "I was angry. People say things when they're angry. You weren't angry. You were satisfied. You genuinely believed she was nothing without you. And now I understand why." Celeste turned to face him fully, and her expression held something worse than anger. It held disappointment. "You needed to believe she was small so you could feel big, and I let you do the same thing to me without even realizing it. That's not fair. I never treated you the way I treated Nora. Eleanor. Her name is Eleanor, and you should probably start using it since she's about to become the most important person in your professional life." Celeste closed the second suitcase. And you're right, you didn't treat me exactly the same way. But you were getting there. The little comments about how I should dress for industry events, the way you'd talk over me in meetings, the suggestions that I was lucky to be dating someone at your level. Marcus wanted to argue to point out that those were just normal relationship dynamics that he'd been trying to help her navigate an industry that was ruthless and unforgiving. But he heard how those defenses sounded even before he spoke them aloud, heard the echo of every justification he'd made for treating Eleanor like her contributions didn't matter. Where will you go? My sister's until I find a place. I'm also updating my resume and looking for positions outside of tech. Turns out I don't actually like an industry where success is measured by who you can step on without anyone noticing. She wheeled both suitcases to the door, paused with her hand on the knob. Eleanor offered me something before we hung up. Said if I needed a reference or help finding work, I should contact Thaddeus Sterling. Even after everything, after I moved into the apartment she'd lived in, after I dated the man who'd devalued her for 7 years, she still offered to help me. That's just her trying to look magnanimous. No, Marcus, that's her being a decent person, which is apparently something you've forgotten how to recognize. Celeste opened the door, then turned back one final time. The charity gala is tomorrow night. You should go. You'll want to see what actually standing on your own looks like versus standing on someone else's work. She left, and the door closing behind her sounded like punctuation on a sentence Marcus hadn't realized he'd been writing for 7 years. He stood in the penthouse that would soon belong to someone else, surrounded by furniture Celeste had chosen and art she'd selected, and throw pillows in jewel tones that had never felt like home so much as like a stage set for the life he'd wanted people to think he was living. His phone buzzed. An email from Patricia Chen with the subject line, "Final offer from Ashford Legal." Marcus opened it, found a licensing agreement that was actually more generous than he'd expected. Helix could continue using the neural mesh architecture under a licensing structure that paid Eleanor 15% of all revenue derived from Synapse Core. She would be credited as the technology's inventor in all future materials. The IPO could proceed as scheduled, and in exchange she would waive any claims to past damages and would not pursue criminal charges for intellectual property theft. At the bottom of the agreement, a note from Thaddeus Sterling. Ms. Ashford wanted you to understand that she's offering these terms not because you deserve leniency, but because the employees and investors at Helix deserve to benefit from technology they believed in. Sign by midnight tonight or the offer expires and we proceed with litigation. Marcus read the document 3 times, looking for tricks or gotchas that weren't there. It was objectively a good deal better than he deserved given the circumstances. Eleanor was giving him a way out that preserved some fragment of his career and reputation, even if it meant publicly acknowledging that his greatest professional achievement had been built on someone else's genius. He thought about fighting it, hiring expensive lawyers who'd argue that the development timeline was murky, that Eleanor's patent was too broad, that marital property laws created gray areas in intellectual ownership. He could drag this out for years, make it costly enough that Eleanor might eventually settle for less than 15% just to be done with the litigation. But looking around the penthouse at the life he'd constructed on stolen foundations, Marcus felt something shift. Not guilt exactly, though, that was part of it. More like exhaustion at the prospect of continuing to defend a version of himself that had been exposed as fundamentally fraudulent. He signed the agreement electronically at 11:47 p.m., 13 minutes before the deadline expired. The confirmation email arrived immediately, along with a single line from Thaddeus Sterling. Ms. Ashford has been notified of your decision. She looks forward to seeing you at tomorrow's gala. Marcus slept poorly that night on furniture that had been chosen by someone who'd already left him in an apartment that represented success he hadn't actually earned. His dreams were fragmented things, Eleanor's dark eyes watching him with that cool assessment, Celeste's disappointed expression, the board members' faces when they'd suspended him. He woke at dawn to news alerts about Helix Dynamics announcing a licensing agreement with Eleanor Ashford for the neural mesh technology that powered Synapse Core, with quotes from the interim CEO praising Ms. Ashford's groundbreaking research and her generosity in allowing the company to continue using her innovation. Marcus's name appeared nowhere in the press release. The Plaza Hotel's grand ballroom had been transformed into something that looked less like a charity event and more like a coronation. Crystal chandeliers caught light from hundreds of candles arranged on tables that sat 500 guests who represented more collective wealth than most countries' GDP. Marcus arrived alone wearing a tuxedo he'd bought for the IPO celebration that was now scheduled for next week and would proceed without him on the executive team. A woman with a clipboard checked his name against a list, looked at him with barely concealed curiosity, and directed him to table 17, far enough from the head table to communicate his irrelevance, but not so far that his presence went unnoticed. He recognized faces from the tech industry, from finance, from old money families whose names appeared on museum wings and university buildings. People who'd been at his wedding to Nora Eleanor 7 years ago when she'd worn a simple dress and smiled uncertainly at guests who'd probably assumed she was marrying up. Some of them nodded at Marcus as he passed. Most looked through him like he was furniture. The head table sat elevated on a dais at the front of the room, empty for now, but marked with place cards Marcus couldn't read from his position. Chamber music played from somewhere unseen. Waiters circulated with champagne and canapes that probably cost more per bite than the dinner Marcus had bought Nora on their first date. Eleanor on their first date. He needed to start thinking of her by the right name. Celeste had been right about one thing: he needed to see this. Needed to understand what standing on your own actually looked like versus building yourself on someone else's foundation. The room filled gradually, conversations rising in volume as people found their tables and greeted acquaintances and positioned themselves in the social geometry that defined gatherings like this. At 7:30, the lights dimmed slightly, and a man in his 60s walked to the podium. Marcus recognized him from the society page as Hamilton Drexel, chairman of the Ashford Global Trust Board, and someone whose family had been wealthy since before wealth meant billions instead of millions. Good evening and welcome to the 30th Annual Ashford Global Trust Charity Gala. His voice carried the particular accent of someone educated at schools that predated the Republic. Tonight, we celebrate 3 decades of philanthropic work begun by Vivian Ashford, a woman whose vision and generosity touched countless lives. And tonight, we officially welcome her daughter Eleanor Ashford as the Trust's chair and controlling beneficiary. Applause filled the ballroom, polite and restrained in the way of people who'd been taught that enthusiasm was vulgar. Marcus's palms were sweating despite the room's carefully controlled temperature. Eleanor has spent the past 8 years proving herself worthy of her mother's legacy, not through inheritance, which she could have claimed at any time, but through character intelligence and an unwavering commitment to using wealth as a tool for positive change rather than personal aggrandizement. Drexel paused, letting the words settle. Please join me in welcoming Eleanor Ashford. The applause intensified as Eleanor appeared from a side entrance, and Marcus felt his breath catch, because this version of her bore no resemblance to Nora Mitchell at all. She wore a gown in deep emerald that had probably been made specifically for her body, her dark hair styled in waves that caught the chandelier light, and she moved with the confidence of someone who'd always belonged in rooms like this, but had chosen to spend 7 years pretending otherwise. She took the podium, waited for silence with the patience of someone accustomed to being heard. When she spoke, her voice carried to every corner of the ballroom without microphone distortion. Thank you, Hamilton, and thank you all for being here tonight. My mother believed that wealth without purpose was just hoarding, and that privilege without responsibility was theft from those who had less. Eleanor's eyes scanned the room, and for a fraction of a second they landed on Marcus. She also believed that true character reveals itself not in moments of comfort, but in moments of choice, when doing the right thing costs us something we value. Marcus felt the words land like accusations, even though her tone remained neutral. 8 years ago, my mother passed away and left me a test. She wanted to know if I could recognize when a relationship was diminishing me, and if I could walk away from it without using money to smooth the path. She wanted to know if I valued my own worth enough to protect it, even when someone I loved was actively working to erode it. The ballroom had gone completely silent. 500 people who'd come expecting speeches about tax-deductible donations and feel-good initiatives were getting something else entirely. I spent 7 years in a marriage to someone who made me feel invisible, who took my work and claimed it as his innovation, who looked at my intelligence and saw it as a resource to exploit rather than a quality to celebrate. Eleanor's voice never wavered, never rose in anger or descended into bitterness. She was simply stating facts. And I stayed because part of my mother's test was understanding the full scope of what I was walking away from. I needed to be certain. I needed to gather evidence. I needed to let him reveal exactly who he was when he thought nobody was watching. Marcus wanted to sink through his chair, through the floor, through the earth itself. Every eye in the room that wasn't on Eleanor was on him. 3 months ago, I walked away. I signed divorce papers that gave me nothing material because the test required that I leave without leveraging wealth I hadn't yet inherited. And the moment I signed my mother's trust activated along with contingency plans I'd been building for 3 years. She paused, let the silence stretch. Tonight, I want to thank the person who made all of this possible, who showed me exactly why my mother designed her test the way she did. Marcus Barrett, would you stand, please? Every instinct Marcus possessed screamed at him to refuse to stay seated, to make some excuse and leave the ballroom immediately. But 500 faces had turned toward him, and the social pressure of that collective attention forced him to his feet against his will. Eleanor's expression held no triumph, no vindictiveness, just that same cool assessment. Marcus took my doctoral research and built a company's flagship product on it. He presented my innovation as his own achievement. He did this while making me feel like I should be grateful he'd married someone as unremarkable as the woman he thought I was. She let that sink in. And in doing so, he gave me something invaluable, absolute clarity about the difference between what I am and what someone else needed me to be. She turned back to the broader room. My mother's trust is now active, and I plan to use it to fund initiatives that help women recognize their worth independent of the people who claim to love them, to support innovation that's properly attributed to its creators, and to ensure that the next generation understands that strength isn't about fighting back immediately, it's about knowing when to wait, when to gather evidence, and when to let someone reveal exactly who they are before you show them what you're capable of. The applause that followed was different from before, louder, more genuine, punctuated by a few people standing in recognition of what Eleanor had just done. She'd turned her public introduction as chair of a multi-billion-dollar trust into a masterclass in patience, strategy, and the kind of revenge that didn't destroy its target so much as expose them to harsh light. Marcus sat down as the applause continued, feeling like his skin had been peeled away. People at his table wouldn't meet his eyes. The woman to his left shifted her chair fractionally away from him. The man across the table was typing furiously on his phone, probably already sharing what had just happened with people who weren't in the room. Eleanor descended from the dais as dinner service began moving through the ballroom like she'd been doing this her entire life, which Marcus realized she probably had before her mother died, before she'd chosen to disappear into the identity of Nora Mitchell, before she'd married him as part of a test that measured exactly the kind of man he was when he thought nobody of consequence was watching. Dinner passed in a blur of courses Marcus couldn't taste. Conversation at his table stuttered and died whenever he tried to participate. People from other tables approached Eleanor throughout the meal, congratulating her, asking about the trust's initiatives, treating her like the person she actually was, rather than the person Marcus had decided she needed to be. During dessert, a small hand tugged at Marcus's sleeve. He turned to find a boy standing beside his chair, 9 or 10 years old, dark hair and serious eyes that were Eleanor's in miniature. Owen, the child Marcus had barely acknowledged during 7 years of marriage, the boy whose presence he'd tolerated but never embraced because fathering another man's son had seemed like charity rather than opportunity. "My mom wanted me to give you this." Owen held out an envelope, the same cream-colored paper as the gala invitation. Marcus took it, watched the boy return to a table near the front where Eleanor sat with the trust's board members and power brokers who'd known her before she'd chosen to become invisible. Inside the envelope, a single sheet of paper with Eleanor's handwriting, Marcus. The licensing agreement you signed last night was generous because the people at Helix who believed in Synapse Core deserve to benefit from it even if you don't. But I wanted you to understand something about why I offered those terms instead of destroying you completely. Destruction would have been easy. I have the resources, the evidence, and the justification. But watching you lose everything wouldn't have given me what I actually needed, which was the certainty that I'd passed my mother's test, that I could recognize diminishment and walk away from it, that I valued my own worth enough to protect it without needing to punish the person who tried to take it. You spent 7 years making me feel invisible, making Owen feel irrelevant, building your success on foundations you stole from someone you considered too simple to notice. And in doing that, you gave me the clearest possible evidence of why my mother's test existed in the first place. I don't forgive you, but I also don't need you to suffer for my peace. I just needed you to understand that the woman you dismissed as unremarkable was always more than you could see, and that your inability to see it was a failure of your vision, not a limitation of my worth. The IPO proceeds next week. You won't be there, but your name will appear in the prospectus as someone who helped commercialize technology I invented. That's more generosity than you showed me, but it's the level of grace my mother would have wanted me to demonstrate. I hope someday you understand the difference between what you took from me and what I built despite you. Until then, I hope you find a version of success that doesn't require standing on someone else's foundation. Eleanor Marcus folded the letter and slipped it back into the envelope as the gala continued around him. On the dais, Eleanor was laughing at something Hamilton Drexel had said, her face animated in a way he'd never seen during their marriage because he'd never given her reason to be genuinely happy in his presence. Owen sat beside her completely at ease in an environment Marcus had assumed would overwhelm a child from a modest background, except Owen wasn't from a modest background at all. He was Eleanor Ashford's son, heir to a legacy Marcus had been too arrogant to imagine existed. The evening ended with dancing Marcus didn't participate in and conversations he wasn't invited to join. He left before the final speeches, walking out of the plaza into April air that smelled like rain and possibility. His phone buzzed with notifications, news articles about Eleanor's speech, social media posts, dissecting what had just happened, messages from former colleagues who were distancing themselves from someone who'd been publicly exposed as a fraud. One email stood out from the noise, from Helix Dynamics board informing him that his termination had been made permanent and that his stock options had been forfeited due to the IP theft situation. The email was polite, professional, and final. Marcus walked through Manhattan as the city pulsed with Friday night energy, past restaurants where people celebrated and bars where strangers became friends, and theaters where audiences watched stories about people whose problems seemed manageable compared to their own. He thought about the past 7 years, about every moment he'd dismissed Eleanor's contributions or ignored Owen's presence or convinced himself that being married to someone simple was somehow doing them a favor. He thought about the laptop she'd left open, the code she'd let him steal, the trap she'd built one copied file at a time while he'd assumed she was too unsophisticated to notice what he was taking. The patience that required the discipline, the absolute certainty that playing a long game would eventually reveal exactly who he was when nobody of consequence was watching. Because that was the cruelest part, he'd shown his true character to someone he'd assumed didn't matter, and it turned out she'd mattered more than anyone else in his life. She'd been the test, and he'd failed it so completely that even her generosity in the aftermath felt like evidence of how thoroughly he'd misunderstood who he was dealing with. 6 months later, Marcus Barrett worked as a consultant for a firm that helped startups avoid the kind of IP disasters that had torpedoed his career. The irony wasn't lost on him. He lived in a one-bedroom apartment in a neighborhood he'd previously considered beneath his attention, and he dated occasionally, but never seriously, because every relationship felt like an opportunity to repeat patterns he was trying to unlearn. The Helix IPO had been successful despite his absence. Synapse Core was everything investors hoped it would be, and the licensing fees flowing to Eleanor's trust-funded initiatives that helped hundreds of women escape relationships that made them feel invisible. Marcus saw articles about her work, occasionally watched her give talks about innovation and attribution, and the importance of recognizing contributions, regardless of who made them. Owen appeared in some of the photos older now and growing into features that would probably make him handsome once adolescence finished its work. Eleanor had started dating someone, an architect named Callum Winters, whose background suggested old money and whose photographs suggested he looked at her like she was the most interesting person in any room. They appeared together at charity events and gallery openings, and in every image Eleanor smiled with genuine warmth that Marcus had never inspired during 7 years of marriage. She'd built a life that had nothing to do with him, which was exactly what she deserved, and exactly what his behavior had earned him total irrelevance in the narrative of her success. Sometimes Marcus thought about sending her a letter, apologizing properly, acknowledging without qualification what he'd taken from her and how he'd made her feel during years when she'd been pretending to be someone simple enough that his theft wouldn't be noticed. But every draft he wrote sounded like excuse-making or self-justification, and eventually he understood that Eleanor didn't need his apology. She'd already moved past him in every way that mattered. The only person who needed him to acknowledge what he'd done was himself. On a rainy afternoon in October, Marcus was having coffee in the same shop where he'd met Nora Mitchell 8 years ago when everything had been possibility instead of pattern. A woman at the next table was working on a laptop code visible on her screen, and her companion asked what she was building. "Just something for work. My boyfriend says I should patent it, but I don't know. Seems complicated." The boyfriend leaned over to look. "You're too modest. This is actually brilliant. You should definitely protect it before someone else claims they invented it." Marcus felt something twist in his chest, recognition of a moment that could have been different if he'd said similar words to Eleanor all those years ago. If he'd celebrated her brilliance instead of treating it as a resource to mine. If he'd protected her contributions instead of stealing them. He left the coffee shop without finishing his drink, walked home through October rain that had already soaked through his jacket, and sat in his small apartment with the lights off as evening settled into darkness. The life he'd wanted, the Hampton house, the corner office, the reputation as an innovator, had evaporated the moment Eleanor stopped pretending to be someone simple enough for him to overlook. But the life he actually had stripped of stolen foundations and fraudulent achievement was teaching him something his mother had tried to explain when he was young and too arrogant to listen, that real success was built on what you created yourself, not what you took from others. That strength wasn't about making yourself bigger by making someone else smaller. That love was supposed to be addition, not subtraction. Eleanor had learned those lessons from a mother who'd tested her daughter's character because she understood that wealth without wisdom was just numbers in an account. Marcus was learning them the hard way by losing everything he'd built on someone else's foundation and discovering that what remained was barely enough to stand on. But it was his. And perhaps that was the beginning of something that might eventually qualify as redemption if he was patient enough to build it properly this time. The rain continued into evening, washing the city clean in the way October storms did, and Marcus sat in darkness thinking about a woman he'd never really seen, and a test he'd failed so completely that even her generosity and victory felt like evidence of how thoroughly he'd misunderstood what strength looked like when it chose to be invisible.